Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. Russian forces are pummeling Ukrainian cities from the air, land, and sea with warnings they were preparing for an assault on the capital Kiev as terrified civilians remain trapped in besieged Mariupol. Equity markets plunge while oil prices soar to a near 14-year high, and safe haven gold breaks $2,000 as investors grow increasingly fearful about the impact of the Ukraine war on the global economy. And more than 1.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion, according to the latest data from the United Nations, which warns of the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe. And the Department of Foreign Affairs has raised Crisis Alert Level 4 for all areas in Ukraine, paving the way for the implementation of the mandatory evacuation for all Filipinos. First in our news, Russia has announced humanitarian corridors that would open in several Ukrainian cities today after terrified civilians came under fire in two previous attempts, and with Moscow's forces pummeling cities across the country. Take a look.
Сегодня с 10 утра московского времени объявлен режим тишины и открывается 6 гуманитарных коридоров. Один из Киева в Гомель, 2 из Мариуполя в Запорожье и Ростов-на-Дону, 1 из Харькова в Белгород, 2 из Сум в Белгород и в Полтаву.
Now, Moscow said the decision was taken after a personal request by French President Emmanuel Macron, who spoke with Russia's Vladimir Putin on Sunday. 12 days of fighting have killed hundreds of civilians and wounded thousands. An unending stream of people, mostly women and children, has poured into neighboring countries in what the UN calls Europe's fastest-growing refugee crisis since World War II. Two recent attempts to allow thousands of civilians to leave Mariupol have ended in disaster, with civilians under fire and both sides accusing each other of violations. On Sunday, a second evacuation attempt collapsed, with the International Committee of the Red Cross saying some 2,000 or 200,000 people were trying to leave and warning of devastating scenes of human suffering in Mariupol. Meanwhile, Ukraine dismissed Moscow's offer to set up humanitarian corridors from several bombarded cities on Monday after it emerged some routes would lead refugees into Russia or Belarus. The Russian proposal of safe passage from Kharkiv, Kiev, Mariupol, and Sumy had come after terrified civilians came under fire in previous ceasefire attempts. Let's take a look.
Це неприйнятний варіант відкриття гуманітарних коридорів. Не поїдуть наші люди з Іванкова, з Димира, з Вишгорода, з-під Києва в Білорусь з тим, щоб потім літаками полетіти у Російську Федерацію.
Moscow's defense ministry had earlier Monday announced new plans for humanitarian corridors, with the defense ministry confirming a regime of silence had started at 0700 GMT. But several routes led into Russia or its ally Belarus, raising questions over the safety of those who might use them. AFP journalists saw thousands of civilians early Monday fleeing the fighting via an unofficial humanitarian corridor in Irpin, a strategic suburb west of Kiev. Russia unleashed another night of relentless attacks from air, land, and sea, compounding the humanitarian disaster that has pushed more than 1.5 million people across Ukraine's borders. 9 people were killed in the bombing of Vinnytsia airport in central Ukraine on Sunday, according to rescue services. And today, the mayor of the town of Gostomel, north of Kiev, was shot dead, with 2 others while distributing bread and medicine, according to city officials. Meanwhile, UN humanitarians have described as unprecedented the continuing outflow of children and families fleeing relentless shelling from the Russian military action in Ukraine. A week since Russia's self-styled special operation began, 500,000 children have already been forced to flee their homes, according to the UN Children's Fund, or UNICEF. The psychological toll that the barrage of shelling and sirens has had on countless families fleeing the country is clear. Here's Jung Gedini Williams from the UN Refugee Agency speaking from Moldova's border with Ukraine. Take a look.
When we spoke to some of the families leaving, it was extremely clear the level of fear and trauma. One family that I spoke to, it was a mother with her 3 children in the car and their 2 dogs. They were all very shaken up. The youngest child, who was a young girl of, I would guess, around 8 or 9, was visibly shaken.
500,000 children have been forced to flee their homes in just 7 days. This is unprecedented in scale and speed. As fighting continues, of course, last night, thousands of children spent another night in freezing and terrified in bunkers, their homes under siege. Children must have peace.
And
Meanwhile, Russia warned Ukraine's neighbors, including NATO member Romania, against hosting Kiev's military aircraft, saying they could end up being involved in an armed conflict. Take a look.
Систем. Нам достоверно известно об украинских боевых самолетах, ранее перелетевших в Румынию и другие приграничные страны. Обращаем внимание, что использование аэродромной сети этих стран для базирования украинской боевой авиации с последующим применением против российских вооруженных сил может расцениваться как вовлечение данных государств в вооруженный конфликт.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly demanded that Western powers enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine to prevent more Russian attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned that Moscow will consider any country imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine to have entered into the military conflict. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has lashed out at NATO for ruling out a no-fly zone over his country. He said the Western military alliance knew further Russian aggression was likely. Earlier, NATO rejected Ukraine's request to impose a no-fly zone to halt Russia's bombing, but Western allies did warn President Vladimir Putin of fresh sanctions if he doesn't stop the war.
Ці розвідки країн НАТО чудово знають плани ворога. Вони також підтвердили, що Росія хоче продовжувати наступ. Як може? 9 днів ми бачимо жорстку війну. Руйнують наші міста, обстрілюють наших людей, наших дітей, житлові квартали, церкви, школи, знищують все, що забезпечує нормальне життя, людське життя. І хочуть це продовжувати, знаючи, що нові удари і жертви неминучі. НАТО свідомо ухвалили рішення не закривати небо над Україною. Ми вважаємо...
Allies agree that we should not have NATO planes operating over Ukrainian airspace or NATO troops on Ukrainian territory. The days to come are likely to be worse, with more death, more suffering, and more destruction. We are not part of this conflict, and we have a responsibility to ensure it does not escalate and spread beyond Ukraine, because that would be even more devastating and more dangerous.
President Zelensky said everyone who dies, dies because of NATO. But NATO Secretary General said that if we did that, we'll end up with something that could end in a full-fledged war in Europe, involving many more countries and causing much more human suffering. So that's the reason why he said they had to make this painful decision. Weapons and more flown into Ukraine, but NATO troops are sent to bolster only the eastern flank, not crossing the border, as Ukrainians try desperately to fight back the Russians. Meanwhile, Brent oil prices soared to a near 14-year high of $140 per barrel as traders fretted over the fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Brent North Sea crude oil for May delivery reached $139.13 shortly after electronic trading opened around 2300 GMT, heading towards a 2008 record high before retreating slightly over the next hour. The European benchmark crude hit its record price of $147.50 per barrel in July 2008, but by 0030 GMT, Brent crude had dropped a little more than 129.05 per barrel, 9.02% higher than its closing price on Friday. The price per barrel of Brent oil has increased 33% since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24. New York's benchmark West Texas Intermediate also soared to 130.50 per barrel for April delivery. It too then dropped slightly over the next hour and a half. By 12:30 GMT, the WTI crude was at 125.5 per barrel, an 8.18% increase from its closing price on Friday. Meanwhile, gold also rose to more than $2,000 in Asian trade on Monday morning as investors fled to the safe haven commodity over fears about the impact of the Ukraine war on the global economy. The precious metal hit a peak of $2,000.86 an ounce, its highest level since September 2020. Traders have been sent running to safety as Russia continues with its invasion of Ukraine, which has battered equity markets and sent oil prices to a near 14-year high, adding further upward pressure to already high inflation. Meanwhile, Germany's finance and foreign ministers cautioned against banning Russian energy imports as the West searches for ways to tighten the screws on Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. With this country fighting for its existence 2 weeks since the incursion, Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has urged his Western allies to levy additional sanctions against Moscow, including boycotting its lucrative oil and gas sectors. Earlier Sunday, Chief U.S. diplomat Antony Blinken said the U.S. and Europe were actively discussing targeting Russian fossil fuels as the war intensifies. But in Germany, which currently holds the rotating presidency of the G7, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said such a move would be pointless since it could not be sustained long term. She said it's no use if in 3 weeks we find out that we only have a few days of electricity left in Germany and therefore we have to go back on these sanctions. This, she told a German public broadcaster. In a separate interview, she also added that Germany was prepared to pay a very, very high economic price. But if tomorrow in Germany or Europe the lights go out, it's not going to stop the tanks, unquote. Germany is dependent on Russian fossil fuels, importing an estimated 55% of its gas and 42% of its oil and coal from Russia. German Finance Minister Christian Lindner was also skeptical of an oil ban. Meanwhile, 3 groups of Filipino evacuees from war-torn Ukraine, along with their dependents, arrived in Manila Sunday, according to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Now, the latest arrivals came from the capital city of Kiev and other areas in the western part of Ukraine. Take a look. The first group, consisting of 4 Filipino adults, 3 Filipino-Ukrainian children with their 3 Ukrainian mothers, arrived in the afternoon via a Qatar Airlines flight. The second group of 2 Filipino adults, a Filipino-Ukrainian child and his Ukrainian mother, arrived in the evening. The third group consists of 3 Filipinos who arrived arrived in Manila on their own arrangements. The Philippine Honorary Consulate General in Kiev assisted the evacuees in traveling from Kiev to the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, while the Philippine Embassy in Warsaw provided for their transportation, accommodation, and meals. The embassy also made arrangements for their travel documents and visas, RT-PCR tests, and their eventual flights to Manila. Meanwhile, the Department of Foreign Affairs, or DFA, has raised Crisis Alert Level 4 for all areas in Ukraine, paving the way for the implementation of the mandatory evacuation for all Filipinos. In an advisory on Monday, the DFA said the mandatory evacuation will be at the government's expense. Filipinos in Ukraine will be assisted by the Philippine Embassy in Poland and the Rapid Response Team, which are currently assisting Filipino nationals for repatriation and relocation, according to the DFA. The DFA has 4 alert levels: Alert Level 1, or the precautionary phase; Alert Level 2, or restriction phase; Level 3, or voluntary repatriation phase; and Level 4, for mandatory evacuation or repatriation. According to the DFA website, Alert Level 4 is issued when there is a large-scale internal conflict or full-blown external attack in the country. Meanwhile, Industry Undersecretary Ruth Castello said government agencies are looking at stockpiling of basic agriculture goods, including frozen meat, to ensure that the country has enough supply and stable prices amid rising oil prices due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Take a look.
We encourage that mag-stockpile. Actually, pinag-uusapan namin na dito sa DTI na kung pwede na tayong mag-stockpile ng agricultural products like yung frozen pork at frozen meat, mga imported siya, and chicken. Marami tayong poultry supply dito, pero pwede tayo nang mag-umpisang mag-stockpile. We want to assure the public na ang presyo po ng mga pangunahing bilihin na intindihan natin na kahit sa ayaw natin at sa gusto, magkakaroon po ng impact sa atin. Pero hindi pa po yan immediate, hindi pa yan sa ngayon. We're looking at the next 3 months bago po mag-epekto yung nangyayari sa Europe dito sa ating bansa. Kaya sana matapos, Yusek, para hindi tayo talaga maapektuhan ang presyo natin. We have enough supply, hindi po kailangan magpanic ng mga tao, and we're also tempering kung meron mang price increases, inaalalayan din po natin para hindi masyadong bumulusok ang presyo kung sakali man.
Meanwhile, China stressed on Monday that the friendship between Beijing and Moscow was still rock solid, despite international condemnation of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, as Beijing said it was open to helping mediate peace. China has refused to condemn its close ally Moscow after only last month touting a no-limit strategic partnership between the two countries. The friendship between the two peoples is rock solid, and both sides' future cooperation prospects are very fast, according to Foreign Minister Wang Yi at a press briefing during the Chinese leadership's annual political congress in Beijing. But he also said China was willing to work with the international community to carry out necessary mediation when necessary. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said last week that China should mediate future peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, as Western powers cannot fulfill the role, according to an interview with Spanish daily El Mundo. In other developments, South Korea said today it will halt all transactions with Russia's central bank. This is the latest in a series of punitive actions against Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. The Foreign Ministry said in a statement it had decided to ban all financial dealings with the Central Bank of Russia, considering the international community's financial restrictions against Russia. It did not provide further details on the scope of the move, saying more coordination with related agencies was required. Seoul on Sunday declared it would impose export controls on Belarus for effectively supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine, without detailing what specific measures would be taken. Samsung Electronics, the world's largest smartphone maker, also announced over the weekend it had suspended all shipments of products to Russia due to geopolitical developments. And streaming giant Netflix has suspended its service in Russia, according to U.S. media on Sunday, in protest at Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The U.S.-based platform had already halted its acquisitions in Russia earlier this week, as well as its production of original programs. Given the circumstances on the ground, we have decided to suspend our service in Russia, according to a spokesperson telling the U.S. magazine Variety. Netflix is the world's leading streaming platform with 221.8 million subscribers at the end of 2021. But it is a minor player in Russia, where it has fewer than 1 million subscribers, according to the Wall Street Journal. And the parent company of Japanese casual wear giant Uniqlo defended a decision to keep Russian stores open, even as rivals Zara and H&M suspend operations in the country following its invasion of Ukraine. Tadashi Yanai, president of Uniqlo operator Fast Retailing, said the conflict should not deprive people in Russia of clothing, a basic human need. There should never be war. Every country should oppose it. This time, all of Europe clearly opposes the war and has shown its support for Ukraine. Any attempt to divide the world will, on the contrary, strengthen unity, he said in a statement. Clothing, he said, is a necessity of life, and the people of Russia have the same right to live as we do, Yanai added. There are 49 Uniqlo stores in Russia. Fast Retailing said on Friday it would donate $10 million and 200,000 items of clothing to the UN Refugee Agency to support people forced to flee in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Meanwhile, hundreds of people are protesting against the Russian invasion of Ukraine in central London's Parliament Square on day 11 of the conflict. Chants of "Stop Putin, Stop the War," and "Ukraine is Europe" echoed around Trafalgar Square as demonstrators showed their solidarity with the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, over 4,600 people in cities across Russia were at protests on Sunday against Moscow's military operation in Ukraine, a monitor said on the 11th day of the invasion. A spokesperson, police spokeswoman, said 1,700 people were detained in Moscow after around 2,500 took part in an unsanctioned protest, while 750 were detained at a smaller rally of around 1,500 people in the second largest city of St. Petersburg, according to Russian news agencies. OVD Info, which monitors detentions at opposition protests, put the figure of detainees in 65 towns and cities across Russia at 4,644 people. Russian police on Friday had warned that all attempts to hold illegal demonstrations on Sunday would be immediately suppressed, and organizers and participants would face charges. Meanwhile, Russia declined to attend a hearing at the UN Stop Court on Monday, at which Ukraine is asking for an immediate order to halt the conflict, according to the head judge. Take a look.
The court regrets the non-appearance of the Russian Federation in these oral proceedings.
The Russian ambassador to the Netherlands, Alexander Shulgin, wrote to the court and, quote, indicated that his government did not intend to participate, she said. Ukraine's representative at the court in The Hague, Anton Korinevich, criticized Russia for not showing up at the ICJ's peace palace headquarters. He said, quote, "The fact that Russia's seats are empty speaks loudly, and they are not here in this court of law. They are on a battlefield waging aggressive war against my country," unquote. Kiev lodged an urgent case at the ICJ on February 27, saying that Russia had illegally justified its war by falsely alleging genocide in Ukraine's Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Mr. Bawal, may ibis ka, oh. Asan? It's a prank! Okay lang manakot. Pero kung mananakot ka para sa boto, bawal yan!
Ayon sa Omnibus Election Code, threats, intimidation, terrorism, use of fraudulent device or other forms of coercion is an election offense.
Sino kausap mo? Makaalis na nga, sa iba na lang ako mananakot. Mr. Pwede! Mr. Pwede! May malaking ipis sa likod mo! Nox! Babawi ka pa, ha? Di mo ako maiisahan! Ako si Mr. Bawal na nagpapaalala sa inyo na ang pananakot para sa boto. Ipis! Uy! Bawal yan!
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. May lalabas natin ang angking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Australian towns devastated by deadly flooding over the past week prepared for further intense weather, with expected downpours halting volunteer recovery and cleanup efforts. The National Weather Bureau warned of severe thunderstorms, major flooding in the state of Queensland, where 11 people died in the past week's floods. Flash flooding is forecast for the major city of Brisbane, home to 2.6 million people. Heavy rains, large hailstones, and damaging winds were also expected to hit further south in the state of New South Wales, including the town of Lismore, which last week saw record flooding and dramatic rescue efforts to save residents stranded on their rooftops. The death toll from the floods in New South Wales stands at 5 after the body of a man was found on Saturday. Meanwhile, Western Australia has reopened its borders after 2 years of sealing them to international visitors and other Australians because of the pandemic. Abigail Karungay from our Sydney Bureau reports.
Western Australia reopened its borders on March 3, welcoming back both interstate and international travel. Starting 12:01 a.m. on March 3, travelers no longer need exemptions or compassionate grounds to enter the state. This is a welcome relief for both residents and businesses. However, interstate travelers must be triple vaccinated, have a booster shot. Triple vaccinated travelers have no need to quarantine at all. Just take a rapid antigen test, or RAT, within 12 hours and report the result, isolating if positive, of course. The RAT will be provided for free by border officials. The move is widely welcomed by both residents of WA and interstate. Just a month earlier, Premier Mark McGowan had been criticized for backtracking on his initial plan to reopen the state. With the sudden emergence of the Omicron variant, plans were delayed indefinitely to increase the rate of booster shots and observe the progress of outbreaks in other states. WA held a third dose vaccination blitz, raising booster percentages to over 50% of the eligible population in the span of just 2.5 weeks. The fall of the hard border, however, means the return of general restrictions. This includes the 2 square meter rule and capped capacities for venues. This comes as WA confirms more cases, with nearly 7,000 active cases reported on March 2. Government case modeling estimates a peak of 10,000 cases in late March, an inevitable increase as borders reopen. The reopening of Western Australia has caused excitement. After nearly 2 years, it has finally rejoined the rest of Australia. Abigail Krungay, Shenia at a Glance, Eagle News.
The number of new COVID-19 cases in the National Capital Region and 38 other areas under Alert Level 1 continues to go down, according to an Octa Research Group fellow today. Since the group's prediction of less than 1,000 new cases by March, Dr. Guido David noted that the numbers might continue to decrease to a few hundred at the end of this month. Let's listen in.
Medyo nag-slow down yung pagbaba nila pero bumababa pa rin. Yun yung mahalaga. At yung prediction nga natin na less than 1,000 cases by March, ito nga, nakikita na natin ay nasa less than 1,000. Inaasahan natin na patuloy pa itong bababa by end of March. Posibleng baka mga a few hundreds na lang yan, baka 300 to 500. Tulad na nakita natin noong December last year bago pumasok yung Omicron. Para mapatuloy natin yung pagbaba ng bilang ng kaso, kailangan pa rin sumunod tayo sa minimum public health standards. Yan yung mga isa sa mga rason kung bakit mabilis na bumaba yung bilang ng kaso natin noong mga nakaraan na buwan at linggo. Pero syempre, hindi tayo sigurado. Baka dahil hopefully not na baka medyo nagiging kampante yung mga iba nating kababayan, andyan pa rin yung virus. So sana patuloy pa rin yung, yun nga, at least yung pagsuot ng face mask, ito ay napakahalaga. Ang malaking tulong nito para mapigilan yung infection.
Meanwhile, Bali in Indonesia on Monday scrapped quarantine for vaccinated tourists from more than 20 countries and reintroduced visas on arrival as the Indonesian holiday island pushes ahead with the reopening after 2 years of COVID curbs. The loosening comes as the wave of Omicron infections wanes across the Southeast Asian archipelago and after some international airlines resumed direct flights in recent weeks. President Joko Widodo has agreed to trial a no quarantine policy for overseas travelers to Bali starting March 7, according to Maritime Affairs and Investment Minister Luhut Binsar Panjaitan in a briefing today. Visitors will be exempt from isolation if double jabbed and holding a negative PCR test and will have to show proof of a 4-day hotel booking. Visas on arrival were suspended 2 years ago when the pandemic first hit Indonesia, but will again be available to travelers from 23 nations, including Australia, the United States, Britain, Japan, and France. If this trial succeeds, they will implement a quarantine-free policy to travelers from all countries by April 1 or even earlier, according to the minister. Meanwhile, Bali Governor Wayan Koster said the reforms were critical to reviving the tourism sector, which used to be the island's largest source of income. And we'll be back with more right after this break. Stay tuned.
Karapatan natin lahat na iboto ang karapat-dapat! Tama! Lahat ng Pilipino pwedeng bumoto!
Kung rehistrado ka.
Ha?
Ang lahat ng Pilipinong rehistrado lamang ang maaaring bumoto. 1 taon ang ibinibigay ng Commission on Elections para magparehistro ang mga Pilipinong boboto sa darating na eleksyon. Kailangan gawin ito para maiwasan ang tinatawag na flying voters. Teka, lahat ba kayo nagparehistro na?
Opo! Rehistrado na kami lahat!
Bakit tahimik ka? Hindi ka nakapagrehistro, no?
Nakakalimutan ko.
Ay, hindi ka pwedeng bumoto. Mabuti pa, bumili ka na lang ng balot.
Pagka kami pa bumili ng balot, pwede na kami bumoto.
Hindi, pero mabubusog ka. Para sa karagdagang kaalaman, makipag-ugnayan lang sa pinakamalapit na barangay o bisitahin ang COMELEC website.
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Welcome to Mobile Legends!
Ani, ano ba? Yung anak natin, patahimikin mo na, patahanin mo.
Ayoko. Weird ng anak natin na yan. Hi, ako po yung nag-a-apply.
Marunong ka ba magluto?
Sana nga, maluto mo yung mga paborito namin pagkain.
Alam na namin ang sikreto yung dalawa.
Oo nga! Bakit hawak mo yan? Couple's necklace na yan.
Binigay sa amin ni Esmigong yan. Esmigong?
Paano kaya kung hindi ako show business? Kasama kaya kita ngayon sa Massachusetts?
Hello everyone, my name is Gianfranco. Please catch me on Letters and Music on air and online this coming Sunday March 13, 1 to 2 p.m. Only here in Net 25. See you there!
Welcome back. Let's meet a Canadian-Filipino entrepreneur who introduced some unique flavors of chocolate in Canada and find out how he started all this as a hobby project. Here's Kathleen Cruz from Vancouver, Canada to give us more.
Kasama, friendship, camaraderie, and collaboration. From Bean Project in the Philippines to a successful business here in Vancouver, Canada, let's meet Vince Garcia of Kasama Chocolate.
So I'm a second generation Filipino. My parents are from Ilocos Sur and Tuao and Cagayan, northern Luzon, in the provinces. They immigrated to Canada in the 1970s, and so I grew up in a very Tagalog-speaking, Ilocano-speaking household. My parents arrived here, and for my own personal migrant story, you could say it's almost a bit of a reverse story. Born and raised in Canada. I recently got my Philippine citizenship a few years ago, and I'm slowly making my way back to the Philippines through Kasama Chocolate.
Being born into a Filipino household in Canada, Vince found himself deeply drawn to his cultural identity through his bean-to-bar journey.
So Kasama Chocolate was a kind of a hobby project started by myself and 3 other friends, Stefan, Oliver, and Dominic. In 2014, I discovered that we had a little bit of property left over in Cagayan, on my dad's side. My dad sent me a picture now that's become very famous. He sent a picture back on our property of himself holding a few. At the time, I thought they were actually mangoes, but they were cacao pods. Told them the story, and they said, "Oh, could your dad bring back some cacao, and we could, as a joke, can we try making chocolate out of it?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And my dad came back with a couple of Ziploc bags of cacao beans from Cagayan, and we just started making chocolate as a hobby on the weekends. It was kind of like a joke. We didn't know how to make chocolate. We just kind of looked online and discovered that. But at the same time, that same year, we discovered that there was a craft chocolate movement happening throughout the world. Cacao grows in countries 15 degrees north and south of the equator. Cacao came to the Philippines during the galleon trade route between Spain, Philippines, and Mexico in the 1600s. So it's been in the Philippines for quite some time. So usually what they'll do is they'll have 2 harvests during the rainy season and the dry season in the Philippines. So it's every 6 months. The cacao pods go from the size of about a jalapeno pepper to the size of almost a small football. And during the harvest, what they'll do is they'll crack open those pods and take out the beans and ferment those beans for about 5 days. After they ferment it, which is a very important process in terms of creating flavor development for fine cacao, they'll dry it for about 2 weeks, and then they'll send those beans out to makers around the world, so people like us. I go to the Philippines twice a year, visit different plantations throughout the archipelago. So what we'll do is we'll roast the cacao beans similar to coffee. We use a coffee roaster, and we'll remove the shell, and we'll grind them for about 3 days, and you get a nice, smooth chocolate.
With 5 years of chocolate making, no culinary background, blind testing and free samples, Vince and his co-founders refined their products and opened a chocolate business. It was only a matter of time that Kasama Chocolate would receive several international awards.
Last year was a big turning point for us in terms of getting peer recognition in the industry. The Chocolate Awards is a very prestigious international competition in various kind of categories. So there's a category for craft chocolate and bean-to-bar chocolate. So we submitted most of our lineup. We have close to 18 bars right now. We got a top 3 medals for our Philippine Durian bar. We got recognition also for our Davao 70% bar. Our Goat's Milk bar won a gold as well, and our Cafe Espresso, which uses Philippine coffee beans and Philippine cacao. So a lot of our flavored bars, we use our Philippine beans as a base. We also do like a few of our single origin bars are from different parts of the Philippines.
Vince's Kasama Chocolate journey brought him back to his roots and taught him what Kasama truly means, in every sense of the word.
Having grown up here and not in the Philippines, there's a lot of the cultural nuances that I was not aware of that I've become aware of now with my trips back. I think one of the funny thing is there's a lot of Filipinos, especially in the province, they tend to ask me, like, why am I here? But what I like the most about it is when I go back, especially to Cagayan, or Region 2, is when Filipinos back home know that you're from that region, they know that your roots are from there, so you're automatically almost like family. I've gone and visited plantations and stayed with families who had not known previously, and they took me in as their own, like a nephew.
As a second-generation Filipino, this young entrepreneur definitely exudes with national pride.
Being a second-generation Filipino, I think it's a nice kind of, I definitely feel a lot of pride. I think in the Philippines, we're not really known for a lot of things internationally in terms of foods that are well received and well loved. And I feel that there's a lot of that here, and just to be visible in the community as someone who is able to do something, I hope that inspires other Filipinos, because there's so many Filipinos and Filipinas that have great ideas. I think now that I've kind of starting to come full circle and understand what it means to be Filipino by seeing where your parents are from and seeing how there's an old world still left over. I'm very proud, and I think that for most second-generation Filipinos too who are looking for that connection, I highly recommend to spend time with where your families, your lolos and lolas are from. It's there and it's very tangible, and it's an amazing feeling.
Join us next time here on Journey, Stories of Filipinos in Canada.
All right, thank you very much for joining us today. And as I always say, I will end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angela. Stay alert and stay informed, because we live in interesting times. Good night.
Gusto niyo bang magkaroon ng tsansang manalo ng 5,000 pesos na nasa bahay lang kayo? Manood lang ng Tara Game agad-agad